This one, we start getting more into the slightly, I guess you could say, academic kind of stuff, okay, with interviewing and skills. I'm actually going to go over skills first. Before I start with this module, you guys are also supposed to read chapter 14 about ethics in writing in the technical field. So I'm going to go over textbooks really quick. I'm going to review kind of a brief overview of all the skills. We're going to go over interview basics, skills basics, interview assignments, and finish up with that. So the green book, that's where you need to read chapter 14 about ethics. It's a pretty short chapter, but you will get kind of some questions in your interview that are geared toward that. It's not going to specifically ask you about ethics, but it's going to be geared toward it. But a lot of what we're going to be using is your 12 Universal Skills textbook. So this is kind of an overview of those skills, and this textbook is important because it just gives you tips and tricks on how to do all of these. It goes over situations that you're going to find yourself in on the job, and how do you deal with this situation if you are on a job. Because what you do on a job isn't necessarily what you would do in everyday life, obviously, okay? And then it also gives you some tips and tricks about how to be successful at that job, how to be kind of the person who everybody looks up to, who does the right things, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so we'll hit a few of them pretty heavy. Other ones we'll just kind of touch on. It just depends on the module that we're working in and what the assignment is. The one coming up in module 2, we've actually got 4 skills that we're going to focus on, and I'm gonna bet we'll end up narrowing it down to a top 2. Skill number 2 here is going to be one of those top 2 skills. Skill 5, professional behaviors, obviously that's what the entire class is about. So that one we might not hit quite as hard, but skill 2 is going to be big. And it actually begins that skill, so it uses the word skill for chapter. So chapter 2, skill 2, it begins with asking, how do you find out which types of jobs you're going to strive for? And then obviously, what goals do you have? How do you get started on the right path? And I really like the second bullet point under there, where you have to figure out what your work values are. And I'm going to give you a prime example, okay? If your work value is to make money, don't go into education. I mean, I know that sounds stupid in a way, and you guys have probably heard it your whole life, but it's true, okay? I told somebody recently that the unspoken definition of part-time in education is 40 hours a week, and the unspoken definition of full-time in education is 70 hours a week. And you get paid half of what anybody else would doing half the amount of work. Okay, so you're doing basically 4 times the amount of work for half the pay. That's what public education is. So you have to have a value of teaching others and of structuring things, of building curriculum, of helping students, of pushing public education forward, all that kind of stuff. That has to be part of your value. And if you have a making money thrown into those values, you are going to be in the wrong profession. And so honestly, figuring out those values is huge. So obviously for me, making money, I mean, it'd be great, but I know it's not going to happen, and it's not a deal breaker for me at my work. Having a supportive team, though, that's a deal breaker for me. I would trade money in order to have a supportive team and people to work with that are good to work with. So that skill dives into things like that. In professional behaviors, I think the number one thing I want to point out there, this profession that you guys are in is aviation, which is Western based, okay? And so you will have people, and you may be someone who is from a different culture that is not a Western culture. And aviation, I'll repeat it, is Western based. You stand up to meet somebody, you shake hands, you smile at them, you look them in the eye. Okay, those are professional behaviors that are acceptable in the aviation profession and are expected in the aviation profession. And so this chapter kind of goes over how to handle an arena where you may not be super good at professional behaviors. Setting goals, it actually goes into kind of a scaffolded way where okay, start with this, natural strengths, work values like I talked about, and then it gets harder. The hardest thing to do is to go out and get a new job if you need to. It's extremely scary and difficult to do that. And so the chapter, the skill of setting goals, really throws information at you about all of these things. And when we start talking about the jobs that you guys are going to actually go out and get, or look at least, setting each of those goals and knowing kind of a contingency plan for various situations is extremely important. And what I'm going to kind of put in here as a little plug is that when you guys do your practice interview, which I'm going to go over at the end of this lecture, have setting goals in the back of your mind. Make sure you've already at least skimmed through this skill, this chapter, okay? Because having those goals in the back of your mind will help drive your answers to some of the interview questions that you get, and that's huge. Okay, talked about professional behaviors quite a bit. There are fewer sections in this skill. The bad behaviors one is interesting. And then formal workplace policies is interesting too. Kind of get in the aviation mindset for that one and look at it from the perspective of somebody going into aviation, and you'll get a lot more out of that chapter. And then there's two more. There's 3 and 6. So I think skill 2 about setting goals is huge. And then actually skill 3, which ironically I left blank on here, is building confidence. And I think those are the top 2 that'll help you most in your interview practice. So building confidence has been an interesting thing for me. I've talked a couple of times about hazardous attitudes. And for those of you that don't know, there are 5 hazardous attitudes as specified via the FAA for pilots specifically, and they're part of a risk management matrix. Okay. And one of the things that I try to teach all my students is that we deal with the hazardous attitudes every day. All of us do. And if you don't admit that to yourself, you need to start, because it means you're not safe. My number 1 hazardous attitude has been resignation. And that automatically kills confidence, just automatically. Because if you think of yourself as helpless, you're going to be helpless, okay? Which is the whole point of why resignation is so dangerous, especially for a pilot. You cannot do that. You cannot be resigned when you're up flying in an airplane. And going and getting my private pilot glider rating was very eye-opening for me when it comes to this confidence thing, and it was pretty cool. You build confidence by doing. So if you're too scared to do, you're never going to build confidence, and then you're going to be stuck in this continual loop, and it sucks, okay? But I actually really like that bottom one, and I'm not very good at that. I'm more like 70% realistic and 30% optimistic, which some people think that makes me a pessimist, and I don't feel like I am, but I'm very realistic. So I need to work on that one specifically. And if I were to go into a new job, a new interview situation, that would be my focus. I want to make sure, okay, all right, I got this realistic thing down, and that's okay, but I need to bring in more optimistic views to my interviews and to my outlook and things like that. Communication's obviously huge. It gives you some tips and tricks about speaking versus writing, and how to use body language, how to smile, how to maintain eye contact. But it's more about making sure the person you're speaking with or communicating with in any way understands what you're trying to say, because you get it, okay? In your head, it makes perfect sense. But when it comes out, whether it comes out wrong or is received wrong or something in the middle happens, like that's where this communication thing can get really messy. So when we talk about, again, building confidence, these are the things that it goes over in that skill. Obviously, perseverance is huge. And perseverance, when it talks about that, it kind of combines it a little bit with procrastination, because if you are to build confidence, if you are to go out and do said thing, you can't procrastinate. You just can't. So perseverance, there's little baby steps that you can take to help you not do procrastination. It kind of does things backwards from the other skill, in that it starts with a big picture and then goes down. The other skill was start up here and get bigger as you go down. But anyway, excellent chapter. Good skill to go over. Take some notes on it. And again, I would highly recommend using skill 2 and skill 3 on this interview thing. Communication, it does go into some what it would consider common sense kind of principles. And then it gets into the whole messy conversation versus writing. You guys will be doing both, no matter what position you're in, no matter what career you go into. Even if you don't go into a career and you decide to live in the basement and play video games for the rest of your life, you are still going to communicate either in speaking or writing or both. So talks about emails, talks about meetings, what to say, what not to say, preparing for high stakes situations and tricky communication situations. I think those are the two most valuable sections because you guys are in high profile careers. Aviation is a very high profile career, and preparing for those high stakes situations mentally is huge. And then communicating whatever ideas you have in those high stakes situations is really scary. We've got one coming up here in Price for the summer of 2025 that I'm scared to death for. And having a little bit of preparation is definitely going to help out for that. When it comes to those interviews, so you guys are going to be doing a practice interview, and I'll go over it here in a second. Set goals and pick skills. Ironically enough, setting goals is one of the skills, but when you go to practice this, and in real life as well, you've got to separate desire versus desperation. You want a job. Absolutely you want a job, but you're not desperate for a job. Okay, you want things to work out. You absolutely, but you can't be desperate. Okay, and making that mindset distinction, I think, is one of the hardest things for all of us. Consider, before you even go into that interview, consider what you can contribute to the group, to the company, whatever. Okay, that's what they're going to want to know. They're not going to come right out and ask you, but they are going to want to know, what are you going to do for us? Okay, yeah, we might give you a job, but what are you going to do for us? Be specific in your examples, but get to the point. Okay, definitely smile, dress nice, have eye contact. And one of the top tips I have that is really hard for me, if you can't tell already, is slow down, speak more slowly. And it's okay when they ask you a question to sit and think for a second. It's totally fine. Okay, they would rather have you sit and think for a second than to jump into something and ramble on. Okay? Most people, I think, are pretty similar to me. When you are nervous and anxious or passionate or excited, you speed up. Start talking quickly. Start bouncing all over the place. Slow down. Okay, take a breath and slow down. So this is the top half of your actual assignment. You just do a recording. Okay, you're going to use Writing in the Technical Fields, Chapter 14. This one suggests skills 3 and 6. I'm going to throw 2 and 5 in there as well. And then there are interview questions and then this lecture for you to use. Okay, your job, here's the list of questions. Your job is to decide on 5 of those that you're going to practice answering. And I would suggest trying them based on your potential job. And then decide on 3 elements from the reading that you'd like to practice, whether all 3 are in skill 2 or they're scattered or there's like 1 from each or whatever, okay? But just decide on 3 elements, those bullet points that I just went over. And then record your practice interview, post it on YouTube. I don't really care how you set it up. You can pretend to be the interviewer and simply pretend to go back and forth. The most fun ones I've seen are somebody that puts sunglasses on and then takes sunglasses off. Okay, whatever, that's fine. Or you can just state the question that you're going to answer. You can have somebody else there with you. I'm okay either way. But in a Word document or the text box, answer number 1 and 2. Okay, so the 5 questions you'd like to practice answering. Tell me which 5 they are. And then decide on 3 elements from the reading you'd like to practice. Tell me what elements they are, and I'll put up there that you need to cite them as well. And then paste your YouTube link, and that's it. Okay. We will have a critique on this first one, and I'll show you guys another lecture when it comes time for that.